Welcome to my presentation on The Basal Ganglia Control the Detailed Kinematics of Learned Motor Skills by Ashesh K. Dwale et al. Before we get into the paper, they utilize a framework from machine learning called reinforcement learning to contextualize their experiment, so I'll briefly discuss what that is. Reinforcement learning is a type of machine learning designed to maximize some reward by repeatedly observing an environment and optimizing its performance. This is mathematically formalized by modeling what we call a Markov decision process. An example of an MDP is shown on the right, with 3 states and 2 possible actions at each state with transition probabilities outlined by the arrow. Now onto the paper itself. Most studies of the basal ganglia focus on how species-typical actions become associated with a cue or context. This is a trivial computation relative to the potential complexity and output that the basal ganglia has. The execution of these innate actions can be autonomously generated by downstream control circuits, so the basal ganglia only need to output a binary signal to initiate them. Additionally, alternative studies have suggested that the basal ganglia control the vigor of ongoing actions, or their speed or amplitude of movement. The framework suggested in the paper posits that our basal ganglia act as a learning agent, trying to maximize the reward in a partially observable Markov decision process. Partially observable because we can't have perfect information about our environment or state. They use this framework to unify the action selection and vigor models and hypothesize that due to the potential for far more complex and dynamic output, the basal ganglia could specify the kinematic details of learned skills. This is illustrated in figures A through D above, where state information from the thalamus and cortex are input into the striatum, where the basal ganglia learn to map to the appropriate output with varying signal complexity for each function proposed in the framework. They examine this by designing a complex motor schema in which rats must learn to press a lever twice within some interpress interval, and failing that, must wait some intertrial interval before attempting again to earn some reward. The first evidence supporting their theory is given in figure F, where after learning sufficient movement patterns to solve the task, they lesioned the motor cortex in the expert rats and observed a preservation of these learned behaviors. Investigating this further, the researchers implanted recording electrodes in the dorsolateral or dorsomedial striatum of 3 rats, looking for activity in this region reflecting time-varying kinematic variables. The researchers focused on activity in the striatum, as this is the region where the proposed state action mapping, or policy development, would take place, and chose to contrast dorsolateral striatal activity with dorsomedial, as both regions show similar activity when animals are performing native behaviors, but when performing expert execution of learned behaviors, previous studies have shown preferential activation of the dorsolateral striatum. Each of the above figures show a statistical correlation or preference for DLS activity over the DMS when performing the task, but the most significant takeaway can be found in figure E. It shows activity in each region average in bold, with the IPI window highlighted in gray, showing a greater degree of activity in both spiny projection neuron and fast spiking interneuron in the DLS across the population relative to the DMS. Now that we've sufficiently shown a correlation between DLS activity and expert movement performance, if the policy is being developed in the DLS, some association between neural units within it and the position or velocity of the effectors of the rats should be learnable. To test this, the authors trained a generalized linear model on the time-varying kinematic variables listed in figure C above to predict which DLS units, or DMS units, would be active. The use of a linear model allowed the researchers to examine the effect of each of the kinematic variables independently and altogether, with prediction results for the DLS and DMS outlined in figure D. Next, they wanted to examine this relationship in the opposite direction, so they trained a neural network shown in figure E to predict instantaneous velocity of the forelimbs and head of the rats based on activation data of the DLS and DMS units, outlined in figure G. Now that sufficient evidence has been gathered to link DLS activity to the detailed kinematics of learned motor skills, the authors need to show that the policy is being learned in the DLS rather than being learned in the motor cortex and reflected in the DLS. The authors repeat their previous experiments and analysis in a population of 3 expert rats with lesioned motor cortices, finding similar activity patterns and predictive power of kinematic variables in neural activity relative to non-lesioned rats. In order to establish the causal contributions of the DLS to the execution of the learned skills, the researchers lesioned the DLS bilaterally in one population of expert rats, the DMS in another, and then created a control sham operation group. Lesions to the DLS disrupted the learned motor sequence and made the rats unable to relearn the sequence, but the other two groups largely preserve their ability to perform the learned movement. I know I just threw a lot at you, so above I've added the key figures that tell the story of this paper, with the main point being this. Rather than merely specifying the initiation or vigor of different subcomponents in a complex sequence of learned movements, or mirroring input from the motor cortex, the instructions for the execution level kinematic details of learned movement patterns are generated directly in the basal ganglia. This has important implications into our understanding of how cortical and subcortical circuits interact.